and welcome to WION Global Leadership Series. I'm Palki S Upadhyay. Our guest today once wanted to be a nun. As fate would have it, she ended up in politics and went on to become the first female president of Ireland. But shattering one glass ceiling was not enough. She resigned from the presidency 2 months before the end of her term to serve as the United Nations High Commissioner for Human Rights. And at the United Nations, she worked on a range of issues, leaving an impact from Africa to China. We have with us today former President of Ireland, Mary Robinson, joining us from Dublin. Ms. Robinson, welcome to WION.
Thank you very much indeed, Palki.
How are you and how have you coped with the pandemic and the lockdowns?
Well, it's been a hard time for every country, including here in Ireland, but we are coming out of it and we have an increasing vaccination of the population. We're luckier than many other countries. I think COVID has really brought home to us the inequalities in our world.
It has indeed. You signed a petition to urge G7 countries to help vaccinate the world's poorest. Where are your efforts going in that direction?
Well, the elders have been, that I am chair of now, following, first of all, Archbishop Tutu and then Kofi Annan, who unfortunately died in August 2018. The elders have been really concerned about the nationalism and the selfishness and the lack of awareness that until all countries are safe, no one is safe. In other words, it's actually the wrong approach. So I did, on behalf of the elders, write to the G7 to urge them to do more. And we were not happy with the response of the G7. It did not go far enough.
Would you say that Europe, by not agreeing to a patent waiver at the World Trade Organization, is adding to vaccine inequity?
Certainly, Europe is not showing enough solidarity. The patent waiver is one way, and a way that the elders would support, and I'm glad President Biden would support, but it's a question of manufacturing capacity, licensing, and if that's not done adequately, then there has to be a TRIPS waiver of the WTO, which has an excellent head at the moment, my friend Ngozi.
So you think that patent waiver is not the best option?
No, I say it is an option, and I think if the manufacturing, we do see more going into COVAX. The United Kingdom, for example, was committing more than 100 million. So was Europe. Biden committed 500 million. I now gather that the Chinese vaccination, they've donated or will donate 550 million. So maybe it's the manufacturing capability. I know India has a wonderful manufacturing capability that has been very affected by COVID. So those vaccines are not available globally in the way that initially it was hoped. For obvious reasons, they're needed now in India. But I'm in favor of the waiver, but I'm aware that it's not the only way of addressing. I think that what Europe is trying to do is protect some European manufacturers. That's not what the elders would wish.
Why do you think the European Union is taking such a tough position against vaccine patent waivers?
Well, it's some European countries, and I think it's because of a manufacturing capability they have and an intellectual property right bonus of that they have that they want to protect.
The question of the origin of the virus is far from settled. Do you believe that another investigation led by the World Health Organization will help?
Well, I understand that there are questions still about the origin. The elders are very concerned that these questions hopefully will be answered and should be answered, but shouldn't be politicized. And we worry that, there's a tendency now to see almost a move towards another Cold War, particularly between the United States and China, and somehow the origin in Wuhan is part of that. We don't feel that that's appropriate at all. This is an issue that is extremely important. We're going to have future pandemics. It's very important we find the origin, the precise origin of this pandemic, but that we don't politicize it.
Who is politicizing it?
Well, as I say, it is becoming politicized in that I think China is perhaps over-defensive and has not maybe been quite as fully transparent as it could, and the United States has been politicizing that lack of full transparency.
How do you view China's role throughout this pandemic?
Well, China, made the genetic composition known very, very quickly to their credit, and obviously dealt with it internally in China in a very tough way, but it worked for the Chinese population, and the rollout of the Chinese vaccine has helped. But I think the question of the original origin is still one that has not been fully transparent.
And do you believe that China is going to cooperate and participate in any further investigations that the international community might think are needed to answer this question of origin?
I hope that China recognizes that it's in all our interests that we do have a way of really ascertaining objectively and scientifically, not politicizing it, the origin of this pandemic, because we're going to have other pandemics and we have to prepare for them. In many ways, the elders are more concerned about preparing for the next pandemic, which means implementing a report that one of the elders, Ellen Johnson Sirleaf, was a co-chair of with Helen Clark, the Preparedness for New Pandemics report, which was issued very recently, and which calls for heads of state to take this seriously at the next General Assembly in a resolution that establishes a high-level threats council at head of state level, so that we can know next time we will effectively deal from the beginning with this pandemic and not let it spread in the way that COVID has done so disastrously for particularly the poorer parts of the world, but also for rich countries with bad leadership.
Mary Robinson, you were the first United Nations Human Rights Commissioner to visit Tibet way back in 1998. Today, China is being accused of carrying out what they call a cultural genocide in Tibet. There are claims that Tibetans are being exploited and forced into re-education camps. What was your assessment?
I think it's the Uyghur rather than Tibet itself. I did go to Tibet as High Commissioner, but I think the problem is in the Uyghur Muslim community in a different part of China.
This is the charge that's being made both for Tibet and for Xinjiang, and I will come to the question of Uyghurs, but I wanted to understand what your assessment of the situation in Tibet was 23 years back, and has it changed over the years in the wake of these recent reports?
It was very important for me as High Commissioner that I could go to Tibet on my first visit to China, which was in 1998, which was the year of the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And China were very keen that I would visit, and I wouldn't visit unless they would let me go to Tibet. That was originally a problem, but eventually they agreed. I found it an extraordinarily memorable visit because Tibet was, and I believe still is, so spiritual. It's different. It's clear that the Tibetan people are Buddhist, religious. They love their Dalai Lama. They, want to retain their culture. And even though there has been a lot of Han, plantation, as I would call it, because we've had Irish experience of plantation on my country, Ireland, and Northern Ireland in particular, in our past history. So I understand the way attempts are made to dilute a culture through diluting the population with other population, like the Han population. So things are still not as good as they should be in Tibet, but they're worse, I think, in the Uyghur part, in the Xinjiang province. So
you're saying you did find evidence of attempts being made to dilute the culture?
Oh, yes.
And as you said, that similar concerns are being raised over Xinjiang, and access has been limited. Michelle Bachelet, the present United Nations Human Rights Commissioner, has been negotiating with Beijing since 2018 for a visit to Xinjiang. Would you say that Beijing is stonewalling these international efforts to perhaps hold it accountable for human rights violations?
I have certainly encouraged the Chinese ambassador to the UN in New York when I met him not so very long ago. I encouraged him strongly to enable Michelle Bachelet, the current High Commissioner, a great friend of mine for a long time when she was President of Chile and head of UN Women, and now UN High Commissioner. It's really, important that she would be able to visit, and I would hope that China would see that that's the way to address these issues, is to cooperate at the international level. I made 6 working visits to China. On the first one, as I say, I went to Tibet, but I worked with China not politically, but for the Chinese people. the largest population in the world. They need to know they have human rights and to have those human rights protected.
You're saying that when you were trying to go to Tibet, there were initially some problems. What kind of problems?
They didn't want me to go to Tibet, and it was ironic. The Chinese Ambassador Wu, at the time, came to see me and said, "We're now making arrangements for you to visit Shanghai and visit." And I said, "Well, you know, I haven't made up a clear decision because you're not letting me visit Tibet." And he said, "Well, when you go to Shanghai, you will see a sign we've kept there which said, 'No Chinese allowed.'" And I smiled and I said, "Well, Irish people understand that." And he said, "Will you send me a history of your people?" And I sent him, I think, 3 books. And only a week later, he said, "Yes, you can go to Tibet." And I think, you know, it's a question of if you don't sort of assert in a politicized way, but rather work with every culture. Every culture has to, you know, human rights have to be imbued in every culture, including the Chinese culture, in the Indian culture. It's not a Western idea, and never was. So I feel very passionately about that.
Absolutely. You also signed an open letter to President Joe Biden of the US, calling upon him to put, as you put it, and I'm quoting, human rights at the center of US foreign policy. This was regarding the situation in Israel. Now we have a new prime minister in Israel who's vowed to do, quote unquote, everything in his power to block Palestinian statehood. What do you make of the situation there?
From the very beginning of our founding in 2007 as elders, we have been concerned. We have been a number of times to Israel, to Palestine, and we've been to Gaza. We're very concerned about the situation, which has not improved, to say the least. There is a new government. The elders we're developing a further policy paper because we believe this is an issue that has to be addressed. It's getting worse. There are more, claims about, the apartheid aspects of it. Human Rights Watch have called it apartheid. Others, B'Tselem, a Jewish, wonderful human rights body, has now said, well, we've got to this stage where we have to be talking about an apartheid system. This is really bad for the modern Israel. So the elders want the resolution of a 2-state solution based on international law. We hope we can visit Israel and Palestine and help to further that under this new government.
Do you think there is the political will and the political appetite to push for something like this in the region and internationally? Because more and more Arab countries are reaching out to Israel, talking to them, and the American position is fairly clear on the matter.
Sadly, there is not the political will, and yet when the terrible situation rose again in Gaza, the firing of rockets and the grossly over retaliation, killing so many and destroying so many houses and schools that are, people really understood we have to resolve this issue. It will continue to bubble up. You cannot have a people occupied and repressed for so long and unable to fully breathe almost in the context of the 21st century. It is true that Israel has been working to develop relations with Arab countries. There would be nothing wrong with that if it was based on a recognition of their own responsibility as an occupier to address the human rights issues. And it's not something that's going to go away or be able to be covered up. It will erupt from time to time unless it is addressed.
And while the rights of Palestinians are important, the fact is that rockets flew last month from both sides, and it is no secret that Hamas uses violence and terrorism as
absolutely, and the elders are very clear on that, and we condemn sending rockets into civilian population and causing real fear and real disturbance and some deaths. But the problem fundamentally is the occupation and the breaches of international law, successive resolutions of the United Nations. That is the problem. It's a problem I tried to deal with as High Commissioner. One of the most difficult problems. You cannot just have equivalence between Israel and Palestine. One is an occupier, another is an occupied people in desperation. And, that's the reality.
Right. Here's another subject that you have done a lot of work on. Let's talk about climate change. According to a new report by the World Bank, climate change will drive 143 million people in Latin America, Africa and South Asia out of their homes by 2050. It's something that was also discussed in the recent G7 summit. What are your expectations from the Group of Seven, especially regarding the refugees and victims of climate change?
I have to say, I'm so aware of the growing way in which people are driven internally or across borders by climate shocks, by climate excesses, by excessive floods, excessive fires, excessive drought, excessive sea level rise. And, we're not coping with refugees and migration enough already in our world. The G7 were very disappointing. They were very disappointing on climate finance. They should have committed to the 100 billion a year, which would be, a promise made 9 years ago or more than 9 years ago in Copenhagen, in order to address the fact that the cause of the historic emissions was the industrialized world. Now the big emitters are also the Chinas and Indias and Brazils, etc. But the point is, climate displacement is a real problem now and will increasingly be, as you rightly said. So we need to prepare pathways to people being able to move as part of how we deal with climate.
You previously said that climate change is not, and I'm quoting you, is not gender neutral and women bear the brunt of its effects. Can you explain to our viewers how the impact of climate change is different for men and women?
There's a very real gender dimension to climate injustice, if I could put it that way, because women have different social roles in many countries. Sometimes they have different rights. They may not have land rights. They are much less likely to have access to capital, access even to training in agriculture. And, I'm more familiar with the African continent and African countries than I am with Asia. But, so many women are smallholder farmers, about 80% of those in Africa, yet they don't have access to capital. Often they don't have land rights, they don't have training, and yet they have to go further in drought for water, further for firewood, etc. So, and yet women are the ones who are trying to help their communities to become resilient. I wrote a book on climate justice, a book of stories, and of those 11 stories in the book, 9 of them are about what women are doing to fight back and help their communities, even though they are disproportionately affected. So it's a two-way. They're not just victims, they're also actors for change.
In the area of sustainable development, you have urged women to be at the forefront of decision-making. Have you seen any progress in this direction? Are more women taking those leadership roles?
Well, it's interesting to look at the example of COVID. Women-led countries have done proportionately far better than men-led countries in relation to COVID. I mean, Jacinda Ardern in New Zealand is the poster child, if you like. She took tough decisions. She listened to the science. She brought her people with her, and New Zealand has done very well. But, the president of Taiwan, close to China, has done well. In Europe, the women leaders, Angela Merkel in Germany, yes, there was a resurge, but she understood the science and, has coped pretty well. And the prime ministers of Norway, of Denmark, of Iceland, all of these have done better than their male counterparts in the UK or in France or, so... and then you look at countries like Brazil, you look at what President Trump was doing, the ego of some of those men who didn't listen to the science, who didn't care about the health of their population as they should have. So I'm very in favour of women becoming leaders as much as possible, of having, parity of power, meaning, 50% of cabinets should be women, 50% of parliaments, but also corporations in the private sector should have 50% women and much more diversity, people of colour, people, LGBTI people, because that leads to better decisions.
Absolutely. What changes would you suggest to boost women's engagement, especially in terms of climate change and leadership in general?
Well, actually, I think women have recognized only in about the last few years how serious it is that we have this climate crisis and that women must step up. Let's remember, it wasn't an issue in Beijing just over 25 years ago. We've marked it with the Generation Equality Forum, and the Generation Equality had a whole segment on climate justice and feminist leadership. I actually moderated that section of Generation Equality in Paris, and I was thrilled to hear voices, old and young, intergenerational voices speaking so strongly. And I myself, because I'm very involved in the women's movement, I'm involved with fearless women, connected women, dangerous women, all different, Africa, Europe, Women Leaders Network, you name it. A real recognition now that women have to bring the feminist way of leading to the fore, because that's the way that will solve the problem. It's problem solving, it's listens to the science, it's listening and non-hierarchical, and it's, very much the leadership of the 21st century. For men and women, a feminist leadership is also one that men are increasingly embracing, like Prime Minister Trudeau in Canada, President Biden himself, President Ramaphosa in South Africa. And more men are embracing a feminist initiated form of leadership that is more cooperative, problem solving, less hierarchical, and listens to the science.
On multiple occasions, you've also praised Greta Thunberg for, as you put it, humanizing the climate issue. And a lot of young people the world over have espoused this cause now in their own different ways. What's your advice to young activists?
Well, I listen to young activists because they give me very good advice. It's not a one-way anymore of giving advice, but I have a lot of young climate activist friends now in different parts of the world, because the elders have been particularly involved in intergenerational dialogue. If you go to our website, theelders.org, we have blogs by young climate activists like Vanessa Nakate of Uganda, like Shia Bastida, she's Mexican but living in the United States, who formed, leadership groups and who are doing wonderful things. What I would say to them, because it's hard working in the climate space, because we're not winning yet. We're getting there. There's a shift taking place that's important. I say look after your mental health, look after your self-care, take time for yourself, because this is tough.
That's very good advice. What is the legacy, Mary Robinson, that you want to leave behind as a woman leader, as a policymaker, and if I may, as an activist?
Well, I think we all know that we are inspired by those who went before. And if I can be helpful in inspiring particularly young women to walk tall, to believe in themselves, and to know that they have a capacity to make change, and then to look at people like Greta Thunberg, who has made such massive change in our way of thinking about the climate issue, because we now think intergenerationally much more than we used to. And it's all because a 15-year-old sat outside her parliament. I saw the initial pictures of this very small figure sitting in her, raincoat. And I wondered if anybody would listen. Now the world has listened. And, if I can help to inspire young people to an understanding of the importance of human rights across the board, I would be very happy.
It was a pleasure speaking to you. Very enriching conversation, Mary Robinson. Thank you very much.
And thank you very much. Thank you.